Under the scorching blaze of another desert morning in Las Vegas, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm. Tourists clutched iced coffees as they wandered beneath the glint of mirrored skyscrapers. The clang of slot machines rang out from every neon-lit corner, mingling with the drifting haze of cigarette smoke that wrapped the strip like a veil. It was just another day in Sin City, on the surface. Outside the iconic gold and silver pawn shop, fans of the hit reality TV phenomenon Pawn Stars gathered with eager smiles, snapping selfies, and hoping to catch a glimpse of Rick Harrison, the show's charismatic frontman. He was the symbol of Las Vegas hustle, a man who turned dusty antiques into primetime gold. But just blocks away, completely hidden from public view, something far more sinister was unfolding. Federal agents, after months of operating in total silence, were preparing to unleash a revelation that would send shockwaves across the nation. A revelation that would rip the carefully polished image of Rick Harrison to shreds and expose a world that not even the cameras of reality TV dared to capture. And then, in the early hours, 6:42 a.m., to be precise, just as the city was beginning to stir, the stillness of an upscale Vegas neighborhood was shattered. A line of black, unmarked SUVs rolled up to the gates of Rick Harrison's multi-million-dollar mansion like shadows in the dawn. There was no warning, no second chance. Within seconds, federal tactical units launched a high-intensity raid, crashing through the front door with brutal efficiency. FBI. Warrant, a voice bellowed, piercing the dawn air like a thunderclap. Neighbors, still in pajamas, peeked from windows, stunned. What they witnessed was more than just a raid, it was a takedown, perfectly timed, brutally efficient, and chillingly silent in its precision. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't reality TV. This was real life, and Rick Harrison was now the central figure in a real-life thriller. For over 16 months, the FBI had been quietly unraveling a puzzle hidden behind Rick's easy grin and historical trivia. He wasn't just a pop culture icon anymore, he was a suspect. What the agents uncovered that morning shook even the most seasoned investigators. The man once celebrated as the poster child of the American dream, the savvy pawnshop heir who built a TV empire on wit, charm, and the thrill of the deal, was suddenly recast in a new, darker role, that of an alleged criminal mastermind. Among the ruins of his reputation lay a mountain of evidence suggesting his empire wasn't just built on collectibles and charisma. It was built on secrets. On deception. On layers of activity that, according to officials, spanned beyond what anyone could have imagined. The FBI didn't walk out of that mansion empty-handed. What they carried out told a story louder than any tabloid headline. Dozens of encrypted hard drives. Sophisticated surveillance systems. Burned phones. And a series of handwritten ledgers, scrawled in what appeared to be a code tracking financial transactions that made no logical sense for a legitimate business. The more they uncovered, the more it became clear, something had been festering beneath Rick's public persona. He had presented himself as a relatable everyman, your go-to guy for a good deal and a better story. But what if that was just a smokescreen? What if, behind the camera-ready smile, Rick Harrison had been orchestrating something far more insidious? Something that wasn't just unethical, but possibly criminal? And the real question, how did no one see it? The answer might be more uncomfortable than the public is ready to admit. Because the signs were there, hidden in plain sight. Minor lawsuits that quietly disappeared. Strange deals that never seemed to pan out. Whispers from former employees who vanished from the show without explanation. They all hinted at something off, something brewing behind the scenes. But the world looked away. Maybe it was easier to believe in the legend than face the truth. Maybe the truth was too ugly. What began as vague speculation has now exploded into a full-blown federal investigation, and as more details emerge, the story is only getting darker. Rick Harrison, once the embodiment of American grit and success, now stands accused of being something else entirely. And as Hollywood dark horse dives deeper into this spiraling mystery, one thing is certain, this isn't just the fall of a man. It's the crumbling of an empire built on illusion. Stay with us, because what we've uncovered next will make you question everything you thought you knew about Rick Harrison. The federal agency behind the raid has remained tight-lipped, only offering a cryptic statement that this is a highly sensitive investigation involving a nationally recognized media personality. But behind closed doors, a storm is brewing, one far more explosive than what the official line suggests. Leaks from independent insiders have cracked the silence wide open, hinting that this isn't just about one man's alleged misdeeds. No, this is an investigation spiraling through a web of financial trickery, veiled alliances, and powerful connections that stretch far beyond the confines of a pawnshop. This isn't just a scandal, it's a potential earthquake capable of shaking the very foundation of public trust in celebrity culture. Millions once tuned in every week not just to watch Rick Harrison haggle over vintage coins or autographed baseballs, but because they trusted him. Rick wasn't just a TV character, he was familiar. He felt like the guy down the street, the savvy uncle who always had a story, a joke, and an answer. And that's what makes the fall from grace so much harder to swallow. The allegations don't just spark outrage, they cut deep. They feel personal. The betrayal is not abstract, it's visceral. Viewers welcomed Rick into their homes for over a decade, believing they were seeing the real man. But if these disturbing allegations are even partially true, then who was Rick Harrison really? Was this a darkness he always carried? Or did years of fame, wealth, and unchecked influence slowly corrode the man beneath the legend? In this special investigative series, Hollywood Dark Horse will leave no stone unturned. We will map the events that led to that infamous morning when federal agents burst through Rick's front door. We'll speak with former employees who were once loyal, but are now ready to break their silence. We'll consult legal experts to decode the significance of the evidence found, and most crucially, we'll follow the money trail. Because money, as we know, always tells the real story. Where did it go? What transactions don't add up? And is it possible that Pawn Stars, a show that appeared so clean, so straightforward, was actually being used as a cover for something far more clandestine? The journey ahead will be uncomfortable. There will be bombshells. Testimonies that shake assumptions. Discoveries that feel more like scenes from a crime drama than reality. But this is the kind of truth that demands to be told. Because this isn't just about one man's rise and potential ruin, it's about the illusion of trust. It's about how easily the public can be seduced by charm, misled by fame, and manipulated by media-crafted personas. Rick Harrison wasn't just some celebrity. He was the face of family-friendly reality TV. If these investigations prove legitimate, then we all must ask, who else wears a smile on screen while hiding secrets off camera? And the raid? That was only the opening move. The aftermath is unraveling in real time, impacting not just the entertainment industry, but the loyal fan base and local Vegas community that once saw Rick as a hometown hero. Now, the city that helped elevate him to stardom is grappling with the fallout. Small business owners, former collaborators, even local law enforcement, everyone is suddenly re-examining the man they thought they knew. But to understand the full scope of this unraveling empire, we have to go back to where it all began. Before the headlines. Before the FBI. Before the whispered betrayals. Back to the birth of a brand that captured America's imagination. Rick Harrison wasn't always a controversial figure. In fact, he was once celebrated as a shrewd, self-made businessman with a love for history and a silver tongue sharp enough to turn dusty junk into six-figure deals. His kingdom began humbly, inside the modest walls of the gold and silver pawn shop, a family venture he built alongside his father, the now iconic Richard "Old Man" Harrison. What started as a typical pawn operation, guitars for gas money, broken Rolexes for rent, quickly evolved into something bigger. Rick didn't just see dollar signs, he saw stories. Every item held a secret, a slice of forgotten history waiting to be reawakened. And then came the lightning bolt of 2009. Pawn Stars hit the airwaves on the History Channel, and everything changed. What Rick and his father had nurtured for years became a global media juggernaut. The format was disarmingly simple. Customers walked in with oddities, Rick bartered with charisma, and experts stepped in to confirm the drama. Civil War relics, Elvis memorabilia, ancient weapons. Each episode was a masterclass in negotiation, wrapped in humor, family dynamics, and historical trivia. Rick became more than a businessman, he became a teacher, a television personality, a brand. His catchphrase, "I'm not an expert, but I know someone who is," was etched into pop culture like a badge of honesty. But now, with that legacy under federal scrutiny, we must ask, was that trusted image simply too perfect? Was it a mask, carefully curated, while darker dealings occurred behind the scenes? In the next chapter of our investigation, we'll dive into the timeline of red flags, the ones the public missed, the insiders ignored, and the FBI refused to overlook. You'll see the documents, hear the voices, and uncover what really happened in that sealed basement room no TV camera ever entered. Because once you know the truth, there's no unknowing it. As Pawn Stars climbed the television charts and Rick Harrison's face became a fixture in American households, opportunity came knocking in waves: endorsement deals, best-selling books, lucrative speaking gigs, and eventually, even a spin-off series. By the mid-2010s, Rick wasn't just a reality star, he was a brand, a multi-millionaire mogul with influence that stretched from Las Vegas to late-night television. The once humble gold and silver pawn shop was no longer a local trading post. It had transformed into a pilgrimage site for tourists. People flew in from across the country, lined up under the blistering Vegas sun, all for the chance to step into the store they had grown to love on screen, and maybe, if they were lucky, snap a photo with Rick himself. But while the public smiled and posed, something inside the empire had begun to rot. As the fame escalated, so did the distance between Rick and the people who once stood beside him. The shop, once beloved for its quirky, grassroots charm, started to feel sterile, artificial, more like a set than a business. Fans began whispering that it just didn't feel real anymore. There were security guards at the entrance, inflated prices on every shelf, and interactions that felt strangely rehearsed. And Rick? The man who once laughed easily and welcomed visitors like old friends, had become harder, colder, sharper. The warm-hearted pawnbroker was now a guarded businessman who smiled for the camera, but whose eyes, many said, looked different. Calculating. Tired. Distant. Of course, at first, no one questioned it. Fame changes people. That's the narrative we tell ourselves. After all, who wouldn't become more protective after being catapulted into the public eye? Who wouldn't retreat just a little bit after amassing millions? But those who worked closest to Rick began noticing changes that were harder to explain away. Around 2016, a distinct shift occurred. Rick began pulling back, not just from the cameras, but from everything. He rarely showed up at the shop. Instead, he vanished into private meetings, secret trips, and closed-door sessions that no one seemed to fully understand. His purchases, lavish homes, expensive cars, and real estate, were increasingly made under unfamiliar LLCs and corporate names. According to a former personal assistant, Rick's demeanor behind the scenes had become unrecognizable. He was paranoid, she claimed. He kept multiple phones, locked his office at all times even during business hours, and would snap if someone knocked without texting first. That wasn't the Rick I started working for. She recalled how Rick, once joyful and magnetic, had grown withdrawn and irritable. His obsession with privacy bordered on compulsive. People began asking, was it stress? Burnout? Or was there something far more unsettling beneath the surface? And as Rick's walls went up, his relationships began to crumble. His son, Corey Harrison, started appearing less and less on the show without explanation. Chun Li, once a fan favorite known for comic relief and goofball charm, was hit with a troubling legal issue in 2016 after police raided his home and discovered illegal substances in firearms. Although the incident never implicated Rick directly and was brushed off as a personal mistake, fans began wondering, was this the first crack in the mirror? Was the wholesome Pawn Stars family image merely a cover for deeper dysfunction? By 2022, things had only grown murkier. Rick found himself named in a shadowy real estate lawsuit, one that accused him of misconduct and manipulation in a series of property deals. The lawsuit was quickly settled behind closed doors, with no public statement, no media coverage, and no follow-up. But in the court of public speculation, silence only amplified suspicion. That same year, another bombshell hit. An anonymous former employee filed a workplace complaint, painting the pawnshop not as the lively, quirky space portrayed on TV, but as a toxic environment, controlled by secrecy and fear. The complaint never reached the headlines. It was buried. Quieted. And yet, whispers continued to grow. Rick's public face stayed intact. He still posed for selfies, smiled in interviews, and cracked the occasional joke on air. But the people around him, the ones who lived in his world, not just watched it, saw something different. Neighbors in his upscale gated community reported subtle but chilling changes. Rick no longer mingled. No more barbecues, no more driveway chats. He kept his head down, sunglasses on, and moved like a man who didn't want to be seen. One neighbor recalled watching Rick grill with friends just a year prior, laughing, loud, full of energy. Then, he said, it was like a switch flipped. Overnight, the life drained out of him. What caused that shift? No one knew for sure. But around that same time, Rick's home transformed into a fortress. Security cameras popped up on every corner. Motion sensors lined the perimeter fence. Delivery trucks began arriving at unusual hours, dropping off large crates and equipment. One local contractor, hired for a late-night basement renovation, later revealed that he was forced to sign a strict confidentiality agreement before stepping foot inside. He was never told what the room would be used for. Only that it was sensitive. And this brings us back to the moment federal agents arrived at that very house. Because the basement, the room sealed from contractors, monitored by security, and shielded from even close friends, may very well be the epicenter of this entire investigation. As whispers grew louder about Rick Harrison's secret basement and the sudden spike in late-night activity around his Las Vegas home, another side of Rick began to surface, one that seemed to clash dramatically with the public persona America had grown to trust. In interviews, Rick started to vent his frustrations more openly, taking aim at institutions that once seemed untouchable. He referred to the IRS as legalized money collectors, and in a cryptic social media post, declared, "The media is always trying to destroy people like me." At first glance, these comments might have been brushed off as conservative frustration or typical celebrity pushback. But for those who had worked closely with Rick, they weren't just offhand remarks, they were warning signs. Red flags that the man once hailed as the friendly face of historical Americana was now spiraling into deep mistrust and paranoia. Behind his once relatable charm now simmered a growing bitterness. It was as if the pressure of his empire, his image, his money, his control, had finally begun to crack his foundation. Because Rick wasn't just a reality TV figure. He was a machine operator. A man who oversaw every second of the show, every guest who entered the pawn shop, every negotiation that made it to air. According to a former Pawn Stars producer who asked not to be named, Rick didn't just star in the show, he ran it with a grip so tight it bordered on obsession. If a line felt too emotional, he'd have it cut. If someone on set gave off the wrong vibe, they were gone, the producer revealed. He needed everything to look perfect. But that kind of control comes from fear. Fear of what? That's the question that began to haunt people who had once trusted Rick without question. And then came the breaking point. One former associate, who had worked with Rick for years and had been considered a trusted insider, made the fateful decision to contact federal authorities. Whatever he shared behind closed doors lit a spark that turned into a quiet but intense federal investigation. What they uncovered wasn't a simple case of tax evasion or mishandled business funds. According to leaked whispers from unnamed sources, it was something far more tangled, a web of complex financial schemes, shell companies operating out of multiple states, encrypted communications sent through obscure servers, and real estate transactions too convoluted to trace on a first pass. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about a pawn shop celebrity who'd lost his shine. It had become a case study in how public image can deceive even the sharpest observers. A man celebrated for his historical knowledge and down-to-earth persona had, allegedly, been hiding something far more calculated behind the scenes. For some, the signs had been there all along. Cryptic comments, cold behavior, a growing obsession with surveillance and secrecy. But it wasn't until pieces of the puzzle began to fit, unmarked trucks, shell corporations, and hush-hush legal settlements, that the full scope of the mystery came into focus. Hollywood takedowns rarely arrive with a red carpet scandal. They creep in, quietly. A longtime employee resigns without explanation. A lawsuit gets filed, then quietly buried. A once accessible celebrity becomes a shadow of their former self. Beginning around 2015, right at the apex of Pawn Stars' global fame, Rick Harrison's transformation became undeniable. Loyal fans noticed he laughed less on camera. Former employees whispered about mood swings and strange new rules. A former assistant, fearing legal repercussions, shared a chilling memory: he'd finish filming, then vanish. He'd lock himself in his office for hours. I knocked once, just to ask about his schedule, and he opened the door just enough to say, "Don't ever knock again unless it's life or death." It wasn't just cold, it was scary. Others who had once been fiercely loyal to Rick began stepping away quietly. According to two former employees, Rick's growing paranoia extended to the contract staff were asked to sign. New NDAs became stricter, no discussion of shop procedures, no mention of private business ventures, and under no circumstances could they reveal details about the off-site warehouse Rick had begun using for unexplained deliveries. Questions weren't just discouraged. They were dangerous. And then, in 2017, the first crack in the polished facade hit paper. A former security consultant, who had worked closely with Rick for nearly 4 years, filed a lawsuit alleging wrongful termination. Though the official cause was vague, the story buried inside the affidavit was anything but ordinary. According to the consultant, it all began when he questioned a series of late-night deliveries, unmarked trucks, arriving like clockwork at a warehouse located roughly 30 minutes outside Las Vegas. He brought it up just once and was told in no uncertain terms, "Don't bother with things that don't concern you." The next day, he was fired without explanation. The lawsuit was eventually settled, wrapped in a thick layer of legal silence enforced by a non-disclosure agreement. But not before fragments of the case, documents, photos, delivery schedules slipped into the hands of an independent journalist who had spent years investigating the darker side of fame. That article, for reasons still unclear, was never published. But the reporter confirmed the materials were real. And somewhere, locked in a file cabinet or cloud server, those documents remain. A breadcrumb trail leading to something no one was ever supposed to see. And that brings us to the real question: what is Rick Harrison really hiding? Because in the world of reality television, everything is scripted except the downfall. Just when it seemed like the dust had settled, the truth began clawing its way back to the surface. In 2019, only 2 years after the explosive lawsuit involving the nighttime deliveries and secret warehouse, another lawsuit hit the table. This time, it came from someone even closer to the heart of Rick's financial operations, an accountant. According to court documents, she claimed she was instructed to create 2 sets of books for 2 private entities connected to Rick. One was designed for the IRS. The other? An internal version that allegedly reflected the real numbers. When she refused to participate in what she believed was a fraudulent scheme and declined to sign a restrictive non-disclosure agreement, she was abruptly terminated. And just like that, she vanished from Rick's world. The case itself briefly flickered in the media, barely a headline, before disappearing entirely, as if the entire episode had been surgically removed from public memory. But make no mistake, the damage had already been done. On the outside, Pawn Stars continued to dominate cable television, pulling in millions of viewers who still saw Rick as the everyman historian with a dry wit and a good heart. But behind the scenes, the environment had turned toxic, suffocating, and undeniably strange. 3 former producers, each with years of experience on the show, painted a picture that was chillingly consistent. Rick had grown obsessed with his image. Scenes that didn't flatter him were ordered cut. If he stumbled over a single word, he demanded a reshoot, sometimes multiple takes until every blink, breath, and smirk was picture perfect. One former producer described it hauntingly: it was like watching a man try to clone a version of himself that didn't bleed, didn't sweat, didn't falter. He wasn't just editing a show, he was erasing his humanity, piece by piece. But while Rick was busy tightening his grip on his televised persona, the internet was beginning to push back. On Reddit, Facebook, and obscure fan forums, longtime viewers started raising red flags. They noticed the spark was gone. The show felt stiff. Rick's energy was off. "Why does he seem like he's always under pressure?" one user posted. Others speculated he was dealing with family issues, or that the show's magic had simply run its course. But the reality, as we now know, was far more unsettling. Beneath the surface, Rick was fighting battles the public never saw, battles that were moving from unusual to downright dangerous. Then came 2020. As the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe and celebrities flocked to Instagram Live to share their lockdown diaries, Rick Harrison vanished without a trace. Not a single post. No interviews. No press appearances. For 8 full months, he disappeared from the spotlight he once embraced. At first, fans assumed he was simply laying low like everyone else. But those closest to Rick say that's not even close to the truth. According to a former maintenance worker who was summoned to Rick's private residence during that period, the real story was far more paranoid and possibly dangerous. The man, whose identity remains protected, claimed he was hired to install bulletproof glass throughout the home, along with a high-end motion sensor system capable of detecting movement up to 100 yards away. When he casually asked about the unusual upgrades, the answer was chilling. "There are people who want to come in," Rick allegedly said, "and there are people who shouldn't." When Rick finally re-emerged months later, the transformation was undeniable. His interviews became clipped, evasive. His public appearances were rare and brief. But the most glaring change was his behavior, cryptic, calculated, and increasingly paranoid. During a 2021 podcast appearance, the host broached the subject of a now infamous warehouse located just outside Las Vegas. The moment the topic came up, Rick ended the interview on the spot, without explanation. Behind the scenes, things were getting even more bizarre. According to multiple insiders, Rick began operating under the alias Eric Lane, a name that showed up on real estate records linked to 4 homes and 2 commercial properties, all located within driving distance of the pawn shop. Strangely, all the buildings were fully renovated, but completely empty. Not a single one was occupied. What were they for? A former IT technician, brought in to upgrade Rick's home security system, later told an associate that Rick had refused to use any standard device with a microphone or camera. Instead, he demanded encrypted email systems, burner phones, and secure messaging apps like Signal and ProtonMail. He was terrified of being watched, the technician said. He wouldn't even keep a smart TV in the house. Then, in 2022, the atmosphere exploded. Rick fired 3 employees in one day. No warnings. No severance. No explanation. The reason? According to one of them, they had started asking questions, dangerous questions. Why were there midnight meetings happening in the pawn shop's basement? Who were the unidentified men delivering boxes and walking away with USB sticks? Why were cameras disabled during specific hours? What had once seemed like the curious behavior of a celebrity under stress was now veering into the territory of full-blown conspiracy. And those who got too close? They didn't just lose their jobs, they were erased from Rick's world completely. But not everyone Rick tried to erase went quietly. One of the 3 employees fired in 2022, Kyle Mason, a former warehouse manager, decided he wasn't going to be another forgotten name in Rick Harrison's increasingly murky empire. What began as quiet suspicion soon turned into a personal investigation. Kyle, who had spent over 6 years inside the logistics operations of Rick's various ventures, knew something didn't add up. Late-night activity, untraceable deliveries, strange men with military posture, it felt more like a covert operation than a pawn business. And so, Kyle started documenting everything. Every delivery truck. Every face. Every license plate. He wrote down times, observed patterns, and even began recording audio from walkie-talkie chatter that echoed through the warehouse walls. He didn't know what he was uncovering, but he knew it wasn't just about antiques or pawned Rolexes anymore. When he finally turned his findings over to the FBI, it didn't cause a media frenzy. In fact, it caused nothing at all, not publicly, anyway. But within the bureau, the file hit like a lightning bolt. Although there was no immediate action taken, the contents triggered quiet alarms. A small, discreet task force was formed under the radar, specializing in white-collar crime with international implications. Surveillance was initiated. Kyle's intel gave them places, times, and patterns. Financial teams began digging into connected business accounts. Investigators subpoenaed shell companies. What they uncovered wasn't a simple case of tax evasion or celebrity arrogance. It was something far darker, far more engineered. The further they went, the more Rick Harrison stopped looking like a quirky businessman and started resembling a man orchestrating something much bigger than a pawnshop TV show. Behind the calm, affable smile that millions of viewers had come to trust was a different man, one surrounded by encrypted apps, ghost businesses, and financial smokescreens stretching across international waters. To those who had worked with Rick, who had heard the sharp tone in his voice grow more aggressive, more paranoid, more desperate. It wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation. His world wasn't cracking at the surface. It was collapsing from within. And then, as if fate had been waiting for the right moment, a strange email landed in the inbox of Special Agent Leia Cortez, an experienced investigator in the FBI's Las Vegas field office. At first, she barely glanced at it. The subject line was vague: "Pawn Star is not what he seems." The body of the email was awkward, littered with grammatical errors and disjointed thoughts, exactly the kind of thing agents usually discard. But something stopped her. The list inside was unusually structured: precise timestamps, GPS coordinates, specific warehouse addresses, and most critically, a photo. Grainy, dark, possibly from a hidden camera or long-range lens, the image showed Rick Harrison sitting in close, seemingly intimate conversation with a man flagged in multiple Interpol files, Roman Zavich. A Ukrainian national, Zavich had become a ghost in international law enforcement circles, believed to be the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated human trafficking networks in the Northern Hemisphere. He had evaded capture for years by changing names, altering his appearance, and leveraging corrupt diplomats. That Rick Harrison, the smiling face of American cable TV, was photographed speaking face-to-face with Zavich was either a colossal coincidence, or the beginning of a revelation no one was prepared for. The anonymous sender, who signed the email simply as JM, claimed to have worked as a logistics contractor on off-record construction projects tied to Rick. According to JM, he had seen black SUVs arriving at a remote compound in Henderson, Nevada, allegedly owned by one of Rick's shell companies. There were no customs checks. No shipping manifests. Just boxes. Dozens of them. Delivered in silence. Removed by men with tactical gear. He said some shipments arrived late at night. Others were buried underground. The most disturbing part? His final sentence. "Look in the basement, and you will see the truth." Agent Cortez didn't sleep that night. At first, she feared it was a hoax, another internet conspiracy theory. But when she ran the blurry image through FBI facial recognition databases and Zavich's profile lit up in red, she knew this wasn't fiction. It was evidence. Within 48 hours, the FBI's anti-trafficking unit had quietly launched a preliminary investigation under internal classification. No leaks. No media. Just quiet urgency. The first step was to check Rick's travel history. Cortez expected dozens of stamps: Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, places known for black market antiquities and underground trafficking. But instead, Rick's passport was clean. Too clean. In fact, he hadn't traveled internationally in over 5 years. No flights. No yachts. Not even a private border crossing. To a seasoned investigator, that wasn't evidence of innocence. That was a red flag. Because in the world of elite trafficking and laundering, the most dangerous men don't leave footprints, they pay others to walk for them. But what they found next disturbed them even more. LLCs linked to Rick through tax audits and cross-ownership revealed payments, large ones, to international shipping firms and financial transfers routed through offshore accounts in Prague, Bangkok, and an obscure tax haven in Tirana. The transactions were hidden behind 6 levels of shell companies, each more opaque than the last. Some of the payments were labeled as asset relocation, others as climate-controlled transport. None of it added up. To the public, Rick Harrison was still a lovable pawnshop guru with an eye for rare finds. But to federal agents now watching him around the clock, Rick had become something far more disturbing: a man with no history, no travel, no traceable movement, yet millions flowing in and out of his invisible empire. And as one agent chillingly remarked, "If you don't leave tracks, and you still get rich, someone else is bleeding for you." Up next, we dive into JM's full testimony, names, dates, and a horrifying allegation that could change everything we thought we knew about Rick Harrison. And that's when it hit them: this wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a fire starting to burn under the surface of Rick Harrison's carefully curated public image. For decades, he had sold himself as the no-nonsense, straight-talking everyman of American TV. But the deeper the agents dug, the more it became clear that persona was just a mask. And now, that mask was cracking. Inside the bureau, the mood shifted from curiosity to quiet urgency. Rick wasn't just influential, he was untouchable. A national figure with millions of loyal fans, celebrity connections, and access to media channels that could shut down rumors with the flick of a wrist. One wrong move, one leaked word about the investigation, and the entire operation could implode before it even began. So the FBI moved like shadows. No confrontation. No subpoenas. Just silence and surveillance. They started small, monitoring Rick's financial drips and drops, noting the unfamiliar faces entering and exiting his known and lesser-known properties, and placing discreet listening devices in strategic locations. Pawn shops, antique dealers, even restaurants with indirect links to his businesses all bugged. And soon, the patterns emerged. Rick wasn't living a normal life. He wasn't hosting barbecues or attending poker nights. Instead, he was holding late-night meetings with a rotating cast of shadowy figures. Always in obscure places, a shuttered pawn shop registered to a shell company, a warehouse with blacked-out windows, or even empty lots with parked vans and no lights. These gatherings weren't casual. They were tactical. No handshakes. No laughter. Just short, intense discussions lasting under half an hour. And the men? They were ghosts until the FBI ran facial recognition and those ghosts started having names. And the names? Explosive. 2 of them were directly tied to active investigations into major criminal networks in the American Southwest. But one stood out from the rest, Eduardo El Puma Ramirez. A name whispered in intelligence briefings, feared in border cities, and associated with the trafficking of women and minors through a web of massage parlors and underground couriers that stretched from Baja California to Nevada. To think Rick Harrison was in contact with this man, possibly hosting him, was no longer just suspicious. It was dangerous. But suspicion, no matter how damning, doesn't equal evidence. That's when the FBI pivoted to what they knew best: money. Dirty money always leaves stains, and they were ready to follow the trail. They began dissecting Rick's known and unknown assets. The results were jaw-dropping. Rick was not simply the co-owner of a pawn shop. He was the silent partner or outright owner of 17 LLCs spread across 6 U.S. states and 3 foreign jurisdictions. Some were registered to P.O. boxes. Others didn't even have office doors, just virtual addresses, disconnected phone numbers, and dormant websites. But the most suspicious was a shell called Silverside Holdings, tucked away in the Cayman Islands. On paper, Silverside Holdings was a ghost. No board. No declared business purpose. No staff. But the financial activity told a different story. Over the span of just 16 months, more than $3.4 million moved through its accounts. And where did that money come from? Multiple wire transfers linked back to shell corporations that had been flagged in prior human trafficking investigations. Coincidence? Or a link too dangerous to deny? What had started as a strange email from a man calling himself JM had now evolved into a chain of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The dots weren't just connecting. They were screaming. The FBI needed to go deeper underground, and that's where the truth started to take on a horrifying shape. Investigators turned their eyes to Rick's personal real estate. Not the obvious stuff, no celebrity mansions or flashy condos. They were after the quiet properties. The ones held under alias companies, off the grid, in Nevada's silent desert sprawl. Using thermal imaging, drones, and even satellite scans, they began reviewing every square inch of Rick's land portfolio. One location, just 45 minutes from Vegas, caught their attention. From the outside, it looked like a typical single-story home. But thermal data told a darker story, a subterranean structure nearly twice the size of the building above it. There were no permits. No contractors on record. No legal explanation. That's when a whistleblower surfaced. A subcontractor, who chose to remain anonymous, stepped forward with a story that chilled agents to their core. He had been hired in 2021 to install steel-reinforced doors, soundproof walls, thermal insulation, and even a biometric security system, the kind used in high-security government labs. At first, he thought it was a paranoid celebrity's underground man cave. But then, something strange happened. He was ordered to leave the property for 48 hours, no explanation. When he returned, there were armed men he had never seen before. None of them spoke English. No contractor badges. No uniforms. Just loaded weapons and dead stares. He finished the job, took the money, and never went back. That testimony was the final spark. The Bureau fast-tracked a federal search warrant. This was no longer just about Rick Harrison. This was about the potential existence of an international trafficking hub buried beneath a desert home in Nevada. A special task force was assembled, elite agents in cybercrime, human trafficking, and rapid breach tactics. The mission was simple: raid at dawn, seize everything, and shut it down before the public even noticed. And so, just as the sun began to rise on a cold February morning, black SUVs and armored vans rolled into the dusty outskirts of Las Vegas. The compound was surrounded, communication signals were jammed, and within minutes, federal agents stormed the property. The ground level was cleared quickly. Staff restrained. Hard drives seized. But what lay below, beneath the surface, down in the basement, is what no one was prepared to find. What the agents discovered underground would shock the nation. And it changed everything. The basement wasn't just some dusty storage space beneath a millionaire's mansion. It was something else entirely, something dark, engineered, and sinister. It was a fully functional underground facility, a hidden labyrinth carved beneath Rick Harrison's luxurious suburban home. And when the agents saw it with their own eyes, a hush fell over the entire task force. Hardened men and women, many of whom had taken down cartels, infiltrated child trafficking rings, and dismantled terrorist cells, stood stunned. The discovery shook them to their core. This was no longer just an investigation. It was now a crisis of national importance. The news spread like wildfire within the Bureau. Secure channels buzzed. Phones rang in classified war rooms. Outside, even the morning birds seemed to fall silent, as if the entire desert was holding its breath. The sun had only just begun peeking over the Nevada mountains when a convoy of federal Black Ops vehicles veered off a hidden desert road, disappearing behind hedges and security foliage. From a distance, it looked like a movie scene, is silent, calculated, almost surgical. But this wasn't fiction. This was happening. And at the very center of this explosive operation was the man America once affectionately knew as the guy from Pawn Stars. Rick Harrison, the unshakable TV icon, was now the prime suspect in a federal investigation that went far beyond illegal trade or financial crime. The Bureau now believed they had unearthed a covert, multinational criminal operation operating in plain sight, disguised by reality TV fame, pawnshop banter, and a carefully maintained public image. Inside his sprawling Henderson compound, all was still eerily still. Rick had been asleep when the first breach was executed. It was just after 6 a.m. when federal agents made their move. The mansion was dark, wrapped in silence, except for one flickering hallway light near the entrance, a haunting visual that would later be described in official reports as almost theatrical. But behind the calm exterior, a storm was about to break. The security was high. Rick's estate was lined with thermal motion sensors, real-time perimeter alarms, and an advanced camera network. Every angle was monitored. Every entrance was protected. But none of it mattered. The unit deployed that morning wasn't just any task force, it was a hand-picked elite federal team, trained for high-risk, high-secrecy extractions. These weren't just officers, these were strategists, hackers, breach experts, and special agents who had rehearsed every step of this operation like a Broadway performance, down to the second. They had spent weeks mapping out every corner of the property using high-resolution satellite imagery and real-time drone footage. They knew where Rick parked his car. They knew which window stayed cracked open at night. They knew everything. The goal: total control. No leaks. No destruction of evidence. No last-minute calls to tip off co-conspirators. At exactly 6:03 a.m., the order came through, cold and clipped: execute. The breach team hit their first target, a side door in the garage. It was steel reinforced, locked from the inside, and supposedly impenetrable. Within seconds, it was shattered with a controlled detonation, a blast that created just enough noise to jolt the occupants, but not enough to draw outside attention. It was Rick's only warning. Simultaneously, 3 other teams converged on the property from every angle: the front door, the glass sliding entrance in the back, and a hidden utility room near the guest house. Using military-grade stun lights, they flooded the interior with blinding brilliance, stunning anyone awake. Within 30 seconds, the house was completely under federal control. No shots fired. No alarms triggered. Just total, silent domination. Agents moved swiftly, laser dots from scopes sweeping across antique cabinets, hallway corridors, and family portraits. Rick was located in the master bedroom, disoriented and blinking under a barrage of flashlight beams. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered groggily, but there was no answer. Within moments, he was handcuffed, stripped of his phone and watch, and escorted outside in his pajamas, barefoot, humiliated. But Rick wasn't alone. Inside the compound, agents restrained 2 other individuals, a woman in her 30s, brunette, wearing a silk robe, and an older man dressed in tactical cargo pants. Neither had any presence in any legal business filings or property records associated with Rick Harrison. Yet both were armed, alert, and later confirmed to be unregistered foreign nationals. Their identities? Still classified. Their purpose there? Unknown. What shocked agents even more was the interior of the house itself, an 80,000 square foot monument to wealth and power. The floors were lined with imported marble. Antique war medals lay in pristine cases. Photographs of Rick shaking hands with politicians, celebrities, and foreign dignitaries adorned the walls like trophies. But the deeper you looked, the more it felt like a museum curated to manipulate public perception. Every artifact, every polished wood table, every book designed to impress, but also to distract. And then, they found it. Behind a decorative bookshelf, one that looked straight out of a European castle, agents uncovered a false wall, hiding a handleless, stainless steel door. No knob. No keyhole. Just a biometric scanner embedded in the wall. It wasn't on any blueprint. It didn't exist on any permit. But the FBI had anticipated this moment. The entire mission had been building toward this. They dragged Rick back to the scanner. He looked terrified. "I don't know what this is," he insisted. But an agent leaned in close and coldly replied, "We do." Rick's hand was placed on the scanner. A sharp beep echoed through the room, followed by a mechanical clunk. The door hissed open, slowly, almost deliberately, and behind it, a narrow spiral staircase led down into pitch darkness. The contrast was jarring. Gone were the shimmering chandeliers and polished flooring. What lay below was a cold, stark descent into something darker. The walls were raw concrete. The air was damp. Flickering fluorescent lights barely illuminated the tight corridor. Fans hummed above. There was a strange metallic smell in the air, like blood and bleach. As agents moved deeper, they reached the base of the stairs. What they found were multiple locked rooms, reinforced with electronic deadbolts. Each room had a different purpose, and none of them were innocent. What they discovered next would force the Department of Justice to issue a national press blackout. Because whatever Rick Harrison was doing down there, it was never meant to see the light of day. But the real horror was only beginning. As federal agents made their way through the labyrinthine basement, each room revealed a new layer of darkness, each more disturbing than the last. The first room was cold and sterile, its steel shelves lined wall to wall with dozens of external hard drives, each meticulously labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes. No names. No dates. Just silent black vaults of information, possibly decades worth, awaiting decryption. An agent flipped one over. "This isn't just storage," he muttered. "This is an archive." Then came the next room. A dimly lit space filled with foreign passports. Hundreds of them. Neatly organized by continent: Asia, Eastern Europe, South America. But what truly chilled the team to their bones was the age on the documents. Many of the passports bore the faces of children, some barely in their teens. These weren't just expired travel documents. These were identities, possibly stolen, fabricated, or worse, used and discarded. The third chamber appeared more modern, a full surveillance command center. Banks of monitors buzzed in silence, displaying live feeds not only from inside the mansion, but from external locations still being identified by investigators. Some showed what looked like foreign warehouses. Others displayed suburban homes. One showed a small, windowless room where a woman sat chained to a radiator. The agents stared, horrified. Who had been watching these feeds? Who had controlled them? But then came the fourth room. As the reinforced door creaked open, the temperature noticeably dropped. The space felt different. Heavier. The air was stale, humid, and smelled faintly of bleach and rust. Inside was something no one on the team had expected to find in the basement of a beloved reality TV star. It was a makeshift detention cell. Reinforced concrete walls. Iron bars welded directly into the foundation. A narrow, stained mattress lay on a metal bed frame. A rusted floor drain suggested the cell had been hosed down. A bucket stood in the corner, used. And chained to one of the bars, still attached, was a child-sized bracelet, smeared with something dark. Scratches clawed into the concrete spelled out nothing, but said everything. One federal agent, a decorated veteran of dozens of raids, took one look inside, stepped back, and vomited against the wall. Another agent followed him, trembling, whispering, "What the hell is this?" By now, the compound had been completely locked down. Forensics teams were called in immediately, sealing the area in full hazmat gear. Every inch of the basement was photographed, logged, swabbed. The once quiet neighborhood was suddenly a frenzy of black vans, flashing lights, and whispered speculation. The press had caught wind. By 9 a.m., the first news choppers were already circling overhead. Rick Harrison, meanwhile, was sitting motionless in a federal interrogation room, eyes glazed, wrapped in a thin government-issued blanket. He had invoked his right to remain silent almost immediately after his arrest, speaking only once to say, "My lawyer will explain everything." But it wouldn't be his lawyer who would reveal the truth. It would be his phone. Seized at the scene, Rick's smartphone became the centerpiece of the investigation. Forensic techs worked through its encryption layer by layer. What they found inside was far worse than anything they had expected. Messages, some in code, others in chilling clarity, exchanged with known traffickers in Eastern Europe and South America. Photos of unknown individuals, some restrained, some unconscious. Bank transfers, untraceable cryptocurrencies routed to offshore accounts. GPS coordinates linked to abandoned buildings, private airstrips, and isolated compounds. Suddenly, all the agents' early suspicions were no longer theoretical, they were time-stamped facts. And it didn't stop there. At exactly 10:17 a.m., a sealed evidence box was wheeled out of the mansion and onto a secure federal transport. Inside was the most disturbing item yet, a handwritten leather-bound notebook. It wasn't just filled with notes, it was a ledger, coded with aliases, transaction dates, and strange symbols resembling markings used by international trafficking networks. Some entries corresponded with the names found in Rick's encrypted messages. Others? Still being identified. By midday, the outside world had erupted into chaos. Media trucks lined the block. Anchors struggled to keep up with the tsunami of breaking updates. The words Rick Harrison, secret basement, and human trafficking trended globally. The History Channel released an emergency press statement: all programming related to Pawn Stars is suspended until further notice. Within hours, every major streaming platform quietly removed reruns of the show. The fallout had begun. Social media melted into hysteria. Reddit threads exploded with conspiracy theories. Was Rick just the frontman? Was this connected to a larger Hollywood network? Had someone been using the show to launder money or identities? For the general public, there were more questions than answers, but for the FBI, one thing was clear. They had the infrastructure, the documents, the communications, and now, the primary suspect. Rick Harrison was officially remanded into federal custody without bail. The charges read like something out of a thriller novel: human trafficking, money laundering, illegal surveillance, conspiracy to exploit unregistered foreign nationals. But this was no fiction. Inside the Las Vegas FBI field office, agents worked around the clock. By sundown, the walls were covered in photos of suspects, coded message timelines, satellite imagery, and leads stretching across international borders. What had begun as a routine investigation had unraveled into one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in recent memory. And Rick? He still hadn't said a single word. But his silence was no longer protection. Because every hour that passed brought investigators closer to the truth. And just when it seemed like the horror had peaked, the rabbit hole plunged even deeper. Inside the FBI's high-security operations center, agents worked in relentless shifts, some running on coffee and adrenaline, others too disturbed by what they'd seen to even blink. What had started as an arrest had transformed into a full-blown manhunt for the truth. But this wasn't just about one man, it was about a system. A machine. A dark, cold-blooded enterprise that had thrived for years under the illusion of stardom, fame, and harmless entertainment. The evidence wasn't pointing to a spur-of-the-moment mistake or a lone act of criminal insanity. No, this was strategic evil, engineered and optimized over decades, right beneath the nose of millions of adoring fans. The Rick Harrison that Americans thought they knew, the quirky, sharp-tongued reality star behind the counter of a Las Vegas pawnshop, was, in reality, a dual entity. One half smiling for the cameras. The other orchestrating one of the most disturbing underground operations in recent U.S. history. And then came the discovery that turned a chilling investigation into a full-blown national emergency. Behind what initially appeared to be an HVAC maintenance wall in the deepest corner of the Henderson Estate's basement, agents uncovered a hidden panel. Inside was a sealed, climate-controlled storage vault. The door was reinforced with titanium alloy, military grade. Inside, sitting neatly on velvet-lined shelves, were 13 encrypted hard drives, each housed in anti-static bags, marked only by strange combinations of letters and digits. At first, they meant nothing. But within hours, FBI cryptologists cracked the first two, and what they uncovered left even the most seasoned agents physically shaken. Each drive was meticulously organized by geographic location. Bangkok, Kyiv, Santo Domingo, Phnom Penh, Tijuana, Marrakesh. Cities known not for their luxury, but for their vulnerability, prime hubs for human trafficking. Inside each folder, spreadsheets, encrypted chat logs, international shipping manifests, offshore transaction receipts, and most horrifying of all, passport-style photographs. Hundreds of them. Faces of women, men, children, each paired with basic personal data, age, height, language spoken, distinguishing marks. Some had medical notes. Others were accompanied by brief, clinical descriptors like high demand, untrained, or under surveillance. Each one had been catalogued like cattle. This wasn't a list of clients. It wasn't even a list of employees. It was a digital ledger of victims trafficked, sold, and traded across a sophisticated web of human exploitation. And the documents didn't just stop at names and faces. They outlined supply chains. The spreadsheets detailed arrival ports, drop-off locations, intermediary handlers, and even currency conversions by region, some noted in yen, euros, crypto, and even commodities like gold bullion and gemstones. One document, dated March 12, 2021, was titled Dom LV House, later identified as one of Rick Shell-owned properties in Las Vegas. Under that heading, 8 names. 7 women. 1 man. Ages ranging from 14 to 22. Next to the names, brutal assessments. Broken English. Disoriented. Bruised left shoulder. Suitable for cameras. And most chilling, prefer buyers using euros. These weren't just notes. They were instructions. Evidence of a commodification process that reduced living, breathing humans into disposable inventory. But the terror didn't end there. On 3 of the hard drives, investigators found a pattern, one drive dedicated to financial transactions, the second to personal communications with associates, and the third to something far darker, visual documentation. Over 400 hours of video footage, all stored in proprietary formats and traceable to surveillance systems embedded in privately owned residences and properties registered under Rick's web of LLCs. But these weren't your typical home security tapes. These were deliberately staged, strategically placed, and often covertly recorded. Each video captured what could only be described as coercive environments, barren rooms, no windows, minimal furniture. People inside them, young, exhausted, confused, moved listlessly, often with visible injuries. Most never looked up at the camera. The few that did, had eyes that told a story of hopeless captivity. But there was one man who did appear repeatedly on camera, always masked, his voice electronically altered, never speaking for more than a few seconds. And yet, despite the attempts at disguise, FBI biometric analysts confirmed what many feared. It was Rick Harrison. In one clip, timestamped November 3, 2022, the masked figure gestures toward a seated girl, no older than 16, and says, "She's ready. Call her." The image is grainy. The audio is glitchy. But the implication is crystal clear. This wasn't just passive involvement. Rick wasn't watching. He was directing. As analysts pored over the videos and documents, one truth began to solidify like concrete. Rick Harrison wasn't just part of the operation. He was the operation. The pawn shops? A public-facing distraction. The TV show? A golden smokescreen. The LLCs? Banking instruments. The fame? A shield. Behind it all, he had built a hyper-coordinated trafficking machine, moving vulnerable individuals across 9 countries, manipulating finance systems in 3 continents, and communicating with a network of over 60 confirmed accomplices, each with their own role: investors, couriers, doctors, forgers, enforcers. FBI headquarters now resembled a war room, walls covered in photos, maps connected with red string, dozens of aliases linked to bank accounts in Dubai, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. The web was unraveling. The empire was collapsing. And the world? Watching in stunned silence, waiting to see just how far this nightmare would go. The investigation took a terrifying turn as it became clear that Rick Harrison's web of deception and criminality stretched far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. The true scope of his operation was more elaborate, more insidious, and more horrifying than a mere celebrity gone rogue. It was a meticulously constructed empire, built on human suffering and illegal dealings. And what agents uncovered over the course of the investigation shook them to their core. Among the bombshells, shocking revelations came to light. Some of the people involved in Rick's activities weren't just low-level criminals or associates, they were prominent figures in politics and business. Names were being linked to his empire, but the full details were still being pieced together. These high-profile connections only deepened the investigation's dark undercurrent, raising the terrifying possibility that this network of exploitation had far-reaching tentacles, pulling in powerful figures from across the globe. The FBI knew they were dealing with far more than a criminal mastermind. This was a vast conspiracy, involving the elite, the powerful, and the hidden players who had ensured Rick's empire ran smoothly. Then came the audio files. Stored securely on Rick's encrypted cloud account, they revealed chilling conversations that would haunt the investigators for weeks. In one particular file, labeled Fall 23 Prep.wave, Rick is heard speaking with a mysterious figure identified only as Victor. But this was no mundane business talk, it was a cold, calculated discussion that sent shivers down the spines of those who listened. "They think I'm just selling antiques, souvenirs, so I'm harmless," Rick sneers in the recording, his voice dripping with contempt. "They don't understand what real value is. Not gold, not silver. People, silent people, people who can't be reclaimed." His words were not only disturbing, they were a glimpse into the warped philosophy that governed his criminal empire. And the final sound that punctuated the conversation? A low, unsettling laugh, one that would later be played in court as evidence of his psychopathic detachment. It silenced the courtroom and stunned everyone listening, revealing the depth of Rick's depravity. But that wasn't all. In Rick's personal office, agents discovered an old leather-bound notebook, a seemingly innocent work diary that turned out to be far more sinister. Tucked away in a locked drawer, it contained entries that read like the musings of a man wrestling with his own monstrous actions. A chilling note from December 3, 2022, described a deal in Bangkok, followed by the mention of a shipment rerouted to Las Vegas, and a chilling line, "Had to prepare the basement because the last group left a mess." And it didn't stop there. A more disturbing entry from July 18, 2021 read, "Had to let someone go. Couldn't risk her talking." The words that followed were far darker. "Still hear sounds from that night. Not sure if it's guilt or something else. These were not the ramblings of a man under pressure, these were the reflections of someone fully aware of the horror he was part of, but incapable or unwilling to stop. It was a man who reveled in his power, in his control over life and death, and who had no intention of turning back. But perhaps the most startling revelation came from the financial records. Over a period of 5 years, more than $18.7 million flowed through various companies linked to Rick Harrison. These transactions were cleverly disguised under vague labels like consulting fees, goods transfers, and personal property exchanges. But the truth was undeniable: these were funds meant to fuel a sophisticated human trafficking network. Offshore bank accounts, shell companies, suspicious payments, they all led to one central, horrifying conclusion: Rick Harrison wasn't just a pawn shop mogul. He was the mastermind behind a global trafficking operation. As if this wasn't enough, even Rick's own TV show, the one that had made him a household name, was brought into question. It wasn't just entertainment. No, the show had served as a cover for something much darker. In at least 3 episodes, seemingly innocent customers or extras were identified as indirect players in Rick's shady network. One, a man codenamed DH, appeared in a 2017 episode posing as a vintage camera salesman. But agents believed this was a front for a covert exchange of information, part of a larger conspiracy unfolding under the public's radar. And just when it seemed like they had found all the evidence they needed, a memory card was found in Rick's home safe, uncoded, unprotected, containing personal data and encrypted communications that were undeniably tied to his trafficking operations. With each new discovery, the full extent of Rick's criminal empire became increasingly clear. What had started as an investigation into a reality TV star with a charming smile and a catchphrase had escalated into one of the most horrifying cases the FBI had ever encountered. From the sophisticated financial schemes to the manipulation of the media, from the dark, cryptic notebook to the covert operations hidden in plain sight, Rick Harrison wasn't just a businessman or a celebrity. He was the central figure in an international human trafficking syndicate, a master manipulator who had exploited his fame, his fortune, and his celebrity status to conceal a network of unspeakable horrors. This was not just about one man's crimes. It was about the shocking truth of how the rich and powerful could hide in plain sight, using wealth and influence to create an invisible empire of suffering. And the world was only beginning to learn just how deep the rabbit hole really went. When the FBI's bombshell report finally landed on the desks of the U.S. Attorney's Office, the revelation wasn't just another high-profile case, it was a national scandal of unprecedented proportions. What had once been a simple investigation into a celebrity businessman had now exploded into a case that demanded immediate, large-scale action. A task force was assembled in record time, federal units were deployed, and the investigation's scope expanded across multiple states, as law enforcement scrambled to connect the dots. The world, however, still had no idea just how far this rabbit hole went. While authorities quietly issued search warrants and subpoenaed countless associates, the media remained blissfully unaware of the shocking truths lurking beneath the surface. But as the days passed, it became clear that the floodgates were about to burst open. Leaked documents, confidential, explosive, and damning, were set to be released, and with them came a wave of voices that had once been silenced. Former employees, who had long feared for their safety and careers, began speaking out about the man they had worked for only to find themselves caught in a maelstrom of criminal activity. These voices, once muffled by fear, were now standing up and demanding justice, sharing the secrets that had been buried under layers of glamour, fame, and public adoration. The world had been blinded by the bright lights of Rick Harrison's TV show, but the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Rick Harrison wasn't just some quirky TV personality with a love for old treasures, he was a master manipulator, hiding behind a facade of charm and charisma, using his fame for sinister purposes. In the upcoming installment of this explosive investigation, the world will hear from those who were forced to live in the shadows of Harrison's empire, the survivors, the people whose voices were crushed under the weight of his success, but who now stand tall, ready to expose everything. Rick Harrison didn't just lose his legacy, he rewrote it, twisting it into something unrecognizable, far darker than anyone could have predicted. In Hollywood, the biggest stories rarely start with grand gestures or shocking headlines. No, they begin with small details, little signs that something isn't quite right. An employee who suddenly leaves, a quiet lawsuit settled in the dead of night, a celebrity who retreats from the public eye. To the casual observer, these might seem like side stories, minor bumps in the road. But to those who truly pay attention, they're the first ripples in a massive storm, one that's brewing beneath the surface, waiting to break. For Rick, that storm didn't appear out of nowhere. It was carefully cultivated, a slow burn that had been smoldering for years. As his TV show skyrocketed to fame in 2015, those closest to him began to notice a shift in his behavior. The friendly, approachable man the public adored was slowly morphing into someone darker, someone unpredictable. Behind closed doors, he was a different person entirely, a man whose outbursts were becoming more frequent, whose temper was becoming harder to control. A former assistant, who was terrified of the legal repercussions of speaking out, recalled a moment that still haunted her. He had just finished filming a segment, she explained, the fear still palpable in her voice. He walked into his office, slammed the door, and didn't come out for hours. When I knocked to check on him, he cracked the door open, glared at me, and said, "Don't ever knock on the door unless it's life or death." I was really scared. That wasn't the man I knew. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were signs, disturbing signs, that something was deeply wrong. And they weren't the only ones who noticed. Other employees also began to feel the growing unease, especially when something as simple as a question could set Rick off. What had once been a workplace marked by camaraderie and open dialogue was now a silent minefield. Conversations became taboo, simple inquiries were met with hostility. And then came the non-disclosure agreements, revised, more stringent, and more cryptic than ever before. Many employees were suddenly asked to sign new NDAs that didn't just prohibit them from discussing the business, but from even mentioning Rick's private dealings, his outside activities, his hidden network of shady transactions. No one was allowed to ask questions, and that, more than anything else, was enough to send a chill down their spines. People who had once trusted Rick now felt they were caught in a dangerous game, where silence was the only option if they wanted to protect themselves. But then the lawsuits started. Quietly, steadily, they began to mount each one a piece of the puzzle, a piece that, when put together, revealed a horrifying portrait of a man who was hiding unthinkable truths. In 2017, a former security consultant filed a lawsuit claiming he had been fired after raising concerns about suspicious shipments arriving at a private warehouse just outside the city. The shipments, according to the consultant, arrived in unmarked trucks under the cover of night. When he confronted Rick about it, he was dismissed with a chilling comment, "Don't ask questions about things that don't concern you." The next day, he was fired. The case was quickly settled with a non-disclosure agreement, but some of the documents found their way into the hands of a freelance journalist investigating celebrity corruption. Though the article was never published, it remains one of the unfinished pieces of a puzzle that could have exposed everything years earlier. In 2019, another bombshell lawsuit came to light, this time, from an accountant who alleged she had been asked to maintain 2 sets of books for Rick's various companies. One was for tax purposes, the other was for internal use, a clear indicator of financial misconduct. When she refused to play along, she was offered a raise and asked to sign yet another confidentiality agreement. When she refused again, she was fired. Like the previous lawsuits, this one was quickly settled with no fanfare, but the silence surrounding it only served to deepen the mystery. While Rick continued to thrive in the public eye, inside his empire, everything was starting to crumble. But the most shocking revelation came from within the very core of the production that made Rick a household name, his TV show. Interviews with 3 former producers revealed a disturbing truth: Rick wasn't just controlling what aired, he was manipulating the narrative at all costs. Segments were red-hot multiple times, ensuring that no moment could tarnish his carefully crafted image. Any instance where he appeared vulnerable or less than perfect was immediately removed, re-edited, and repackaged for public consumption. Rick wasn't just the star of the show, he was the puppet master, pulling every string, manipulating every scene, and hiding his true self from the world. And as the investigation continued, it became more and more clear, what the world had seen was just a mask. Behind it was something far darker, far more dangerous than anyone could have ever imagined. One former producer, who had been on the inside during the show's heyday, described watching Rick Harrison slowly and deliberately erase the man he once was, all in the name of creating a flawless, marketable version of himself for the camera. It was like watching a man craft a mask, one designed to be believable, even though behind the scenes, that wasn't who he truly was, the producer remarked. And the transformation didn't go unnoticed. As Rick's on-screen persona began to shift into something more polished and controlled, loyal viewers who had once felt a connection with the man behind the pawn shop began to voice their concerns on social media platforms like Reddit and Facebook. What was once a charming, relatable businessman was now becoming an enigma. Fans started to notice the subtle but undeniable changes. Rick appeared more stressed, his interactions with customers seemed forced, and his demeanor felt increasingly awkward and unnatural. While some speculated that Rick might be dealing with personal problems or facing the natural decline of a long-running TV show, no one could have guessed the truth. Behind those meticulously edited scenes, Rick Harrison wasn't just hiding behind a TV show, he was hiding something much more sinister, a secret so deep and so dangerous that even the most loyal followers would be left stunned when it finally came to light. In 2020, as the world was gripped by the global pandemic, many celebrities turned to social media and streaming to keep their fans engaged and offer a glimpse into their lives. But Rick Harrison? He vanished completely. 8 long months went by without a single public appearance, no updates, no interviews, no video posts. Fans began to panic. Was he sick? Was he taking time off for personal reasons? Speculation ran wild. But those who had worked closely with Rick knew something wasn't right. His sudden disappearance wasn't just a break from the spotlight, it was part of something much darker. A former maintenance worker at Rick's private residence revealed chilling details about what was going on behind the scenes during those missing months. "I was called in to install a series of new security systems," he explained. "Reinforced locks, bulletproof glass, motion sensors, the works." When he asked why such extreme measures were needed, Rick's answer sent shivers down his spine. "There are people who should know, and there are people who shouldn't." The warning was clear, there was more to Rick Harrison's world than anyone realized, and some things, some truths, were being carefully concealed. When Rick finally resurfaced, it was clear that he had changed. Gone was the charismatic TV personality, in his place was someone more secretive, more defensive, and more paranoid. His interviews became rare, and when he did appear, he was visibly on edge, often tense, even combative. The shift in his behavior was undeniable. In one shocking moment during a podcast, when Rick was confronted with rumors about a secret warehouse in the Las Vegas suburbs, a warehouse that would later become the focus of a massive federal investigation, Rick's response was nothing short of bizarre. He abruptly ended the conversation and walked out, refusing to answer any questions. But it wasn't just his public outbursts that had people talking, it was the signs of paranoia that seemed to be growing. Sources close to Rick revealed that he had started using aliases for real estate transactions, with the name Eric Lane appearing on the property records of at least 4 homes and 2 commercial buildings, all within close proximity to the famous pawn shop. The properties were extensively renovated, yet strangely, all of them were left vacant. This wasn't just bad business practice, it was a warning. Rick wasn't just hiding from the public eye, he was hiding from something far bigger. And it didn't stop there. According to multiple reports, Rick had completely switched to using encrypted communication platforms, like Signal and WhatsApp, to connect with unknown associates. A former IT technician who had been hired to upgrade his security systems recounted a chilling conversation with Rick. "The phone is how they get to you," Rick had said, his eyes darting around the room. When the technician asked who they were, Rick's cryptic response was, "Maybe it's advertisers." But the technician wasn't convinced. "I'm not sure who he's talking about anymore," he said, echoing the growing confusion and fear surrounding Rick's increasingly bizarre actions. The final straw came in 2022, when Rick shockingly fired 3 employees in one day, without warning, without explanation, and without severance pay. These were people who had been loyal to him, people who had helped build his empire. But when they began raising concerns about strange activities happening at the pawn shop, midnight meetings in the basement, unidentified packages arriving, and especially the USB sticks being exchanged between Rick and mysterious men in dark suits, they found themselves out of a job. Desperate to get to the bottom of it, one employee, Kyle Mason, a former warehouse manager, took matters into his own hands. He began to quietly collect evidence, license plate numbers, delivery times, descriptions of the men who came and went. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking at, but his instincts told him that something wasn't right. Eventually, Kyle sent everything he had gathered to the FBI. And that's when the whispers of something illicit began to take shape. The FBI's investigation, which had once been a quiet background operation, suddenly exploded into full swing. Surveillance cameras were set up, financial records were subpoenaed in secret, and undercover agents were embedded within Rick's inner circle. As the layers of deception peeled away, the full extent of Rick Harrison's criminal activities began to emerge. Rick Harrison wasn't just a flawed businessman or a man with a bad temper. He wasn't simply a star who had lost his way. What he was hiding went far beyond anything the public could have imagined. He wasn't just running a pawn shop, he was at the center of something deeply illegal, something meticulously concealed and dangerous. And as the investigation continued to uncover the truth, it became clear, the cracks that had once been attributed to personal eccentricities were now seen as warning signs of a system on the verge of collapse. To the public, Rick Harrison was just a beloved TV personality. But to those who had been paying attention, who had seen the slow unraveling of his empire, the truth was far more sinister. This was no longer a story of a man losing control, it was the story of a man trying desperately to hold onto a web of lies that was now slipping through his fingers. The news broke, the investigation continued, and for many, what had once seemed like a shocking revelation was now inevitable. It all began on a cold Tuesday morning, a seemingly routine day in the FBI's Las Vegas field office. Special Agent Leia Cortez was about to receive an email that would change everything. The subject line, cryptic and odd, read, "Panner is not what he seems." At first glance, it appeared to be just another rambling message, one of those wild conspiracy theories that flooded the inboxes of investigators working in a city like Vegas, where the glitz and glamour often mask the most sinister secrets. Usually, these messages were dismissed as delusions. But this one? It felt different. It was written with precision, a clear structure, complete with a specific name, a location, and an unsettlingly specific photo. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. Rick Harrison, the beloved star of Pawn Stars, sitting across from a man in a shadowy, dimly lit room. And the man in the photo? Roman Zavich, a name that sent chills down the spines of those in the FBI. Zavich had been on their radar for nearly a decade, suspected of running a transnational human trafficking network that stretched from Eastern Europe to the southwestern United States. What was Rick Harrison doing with a known criminal figure like Zavich? This wasn't just an innocent meeting, it was a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The email sender identified himself as JM, a former logistics contractor who claimed to have witnessed strange shipments arriving at a property Rick owned in suburban Henderson. According to JM, these shipments had no proper documentation, no customs clearance, no paperwork, and no manifests. Just boxes, trucks, and armed guards standing watch over the area. The final line of the email sent a cold shiver through Cortez. Look down in the basement, and you'll see the real him. Despite the unsettling content, Cortez didn't act immediately. But something about this message didn't sit right with her. She shared it with her superiors, who at first brushed it off as just another false scare. But then, everything changed. When the identity of Roman Zavich was confirmed, it was like a light bulb went off. Within 48 hours, the FBI's Domestic Human Trafficking Unit launched an urgent investigation. At first, they stuck to the basics, looking into travel records, financial transactions, and the usual suspects. But the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered a side of Rick Harrison that the public never saw. The first shocking discovery was that Rick's travel records were eerily clean. For someone who made his fortune collecting rare antiques and dealing with high-profile clients, one would expect him to be constantly traveling. Yet, Rick hadn't used a passport in over 5 years, nor had he flown on private jets or sailed on cruise ships, the typical haunts of a global businessman. But then, the bank statements from his companies told a different story. Large transfers were made to mysterious accounts in Prague, Bangkok, and a place called Tirana, along with payments to international shipping companies. Nothing added up. This wasn't just bad accounting, it was a red flag. It became clear that the FBI was dealing with something far more complex than anyone initially realized. Cautious but resolute, the FBI didn't jump to conclusions. They knew that, as a well-known TV personality, Rick Harrison was a delicate subject. Any wrong move could spark a media frenzy. So instead of rushing in, they opted for a more discreet approach, quietly monitoring his activities, recording who came and went from his properties, and even installing listening devices at certain businesses connected to him. And what they uncovered shocked them. Rick's movements were oddly secretive. Late-night meetings, always at random locations, sometimes in storage units, sometimes in closed pawn shops he had acquired through front companies. Each meeting was brief, less than 30 minutes, and the participants always arrived alone, left separately, and never seemed to be in a hurry. Facial recognition software was used, and soon, the agents realized that two of the men Rick was meeting with had connections to notorious criminal organizations operating in New Mexico and Southern California. One of them, Eduardo El Puma Ramirez, was linked to a human trafficking network running through Baja, Mexico, which funneled victims into Nevada through underground massage parlors and secret transportation services. Though no solid evidence had emerged yet, it was clear that Rick's behavior was becoming more suspicious by the day. Then came the financial bombshell: Rick wasn't just a pawn shop mogul. He was a silent partner in 17 companies spanning 6 states and 3 countries. Some of these companies were registered with fake addresses, had no employees, and operated in complete secrecy. One company, Silverside Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, stood out. It had no public records, no visible board members, and yet it had generated over $3.4 million in just 16 months. The financial patterns were eerily similar to the activities that JM had warned about, activities tied to international human trafficking. The investigation didn't stop there. Real estate agents, using drones, thermal imaging, and satellite footage, inspected Rick's properties. One property, just 45 minutes from Las Vegas, showed clear signs of underground construction. Heat maps revealed a basement twice the size of the main floor, but no building permits, no contractors, no records of any kind. Something was being hidden underground, and the agents couldn't ignore the possibility that this could be the key to solving the entire mystery. As the investigation expanded and the pieces began to fall into place, it became clear that Rick Harrison wasn't just a pawn shop owner. He was operating a covert empire, one that was deeply embedded in criminal activity, with connections to some of the most dangerous networks in the world. And the worst part? They were just getting started. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the dark side of Rick Harrison's world. If you found this video captivating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you can stay up to date with all the explosive stories we've got coming your way.